Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to Fired Up. My name's Morgan McLintic, and I'm joined today by Chris Ulbrich. Hey, Chris. How are you doing?
Hey, doing great. Great to be here.
So today we're going to talk about how to be a great spokesperson. This is a key role for your senior execs, and we want to dive into what makes a great spokesperson, how they should prepare, how they should actually handle the interview. We'll talk about a little bit about follow-up because it's a fundamental part of a PR program and you want to get it right. So, Chris, what do you think a spokesperson should be aiming to accomplish, just so that we know when we say great, what do we mean by a great spokesperson?
Right. Another way you can put it is how to be great in an interview, because I think the number one thing that is going to help a spokesperson perform well in an interview is understanding what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to get out of the call. It's usually a phone call. Sometimes you might be face-to-face at a conference, for instance, even more rarely on something like a broadcast interview. But generally speaking, you're going to be on Zoom these days. But in either case, it's really about the most successful interviews happen when the spokesperson comes in knowing what they need to get out of the conversation, because the reporter is going to come in with their agenda. You're going to come in with your agenda. Ideally, you try to make the two mesh as much as possible. If you and the reporter are completely at odds, you're going to run into issues. The starting point is to understand what you're trying to do. And it's amazing how often that's not the case. I would say that this is, in a way, just as much the responsibility of the PR team prepping the spokesperson as it is the spokesperson. I mean, it's a two-way street, right? Every PR person is familiar with the phenomenon of providing preparation materials to a spokesperson who just doesn't either care to read them or doesn't have time to read them, and they show up to the interview unprepared. The spokesperson typically, and let's be honest here, typically we're talking about a senior executive in the company, and they have reason to think, look, I talk about this stuff all the time. I talk about this stuff off the cuff. I know it inside and out. I don't really need to prep, and I don't need anyone else to tell me what are my 3 key points to get across, they think. The problem with that is that it is possible to go wrong by knowing too much and not selecting from your knowledge. Also, not matching what you know to what the reporter is trying to get across, because you only have typically 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. And you have to be strategic about how you're presenting what you present. Now, I've been impressed over the course of my career with the quality of the spokespeople I've worked with, even when they don't have much media experience. I find that CEOs, senior executives, are pretty good at explaining their company, their technology, probably because they've had to do it to investors and customers. They've had the reps, right?
Yeah.
So you're starting from a good base there. It's also important to meet the reporter where they are. That comes back to the prep that your PR team, whether that's an agency or your in-house team, have put together for you. They've been in touch with the reporter. They know what the reporter is looking to do, and they'll have some ideas about where you as a spokesperson for this company intersect with what the reporter needs. So knowing what you want to accomplish is very closely related to this idea of hitting your key messages. Typically, your prep team will have identified 3 or 4 points that no matter what else happens in the interview, you want to get across. Those are your key messages. I find that when executives have internalized those, it acts as a scaffolding for the rest of the interview. If they are aware and they've rehearsed a little bit, this is the spokespeople, some of the key lines, sound bites, or messages they want to get across, then it's easy for them to slot those into the conversation. It feels natural for them, and it keeps the conversation on track in a way that it sometimes, in a not so great scenario, the spokesperson will just sort of wander off course because they haven't internalized their key messages.
Right. I think that is a key point on the messaging, right? Because a journalist is not buying the product. Like your standard, you say you're the CEO, I'm used to selling my product, my company. Like the marketing messages
Yeah.
are not the same as the media messages. And say it's a product announcement and you're lined up to talk about, hey, here's all the new features. There are going to be a lot of features in this new release, let's say. In the press release, we'd probably just taken a bit of an angle on it to make it different. And so the messages that we say in the interview have to reinforce the angle that we've got in the press release, because that's what's been sold into the reporter. And if you come in then and start talking about a whole different bunch of features that we weren't going to foreground, then the resulting article, if there is one, is going to be muddled. And so, understanding that, okay, a reporter's not buying the product and we're not going to be talking about every feature in this announcement. We've got a particular angle. The messages might be new to you. So you do, I think, actually need to sort of hone in for each interview on the specific messages you're going to get across.
Yeah, I think that's dead right. And it's a really good point about, and it gets back to what I said earlier about needing to meet the reporter halfway where they are, right? Because typically a reporter is going to be operating at a sort of more general level of detail than you are or your buyer is. Some trade reporters or analysts are effectively operating at the same level as you or your buyer in terms of, being able to get across the detail, and they're interested in that level of detail. But more often, you'll be talking to a reporter because your product or your company is representative of a trend that's in the news, and they only need a sort of a general idea of what you do and how you do it. They may be much more interested in sort of what you're seeing in the market, what the impact of such and such economic development is on tariffs on your business, for instance. And they just need to know enough about what you do to accurately represent it in their story. But their story is not going to be about what you do. The more time you're spending talking to them about those details that are irrelevant to this particular story, the less you're talking about subjects that could actually show up in the story.
So, I mean, another goal of having an interview is to sort of just build the relationship with these reporters, right? Critical. So there's this interview, but then hopefully there are going to be future interviews. And so let's just talk a little bit about that.
Right. So we've talked about the number one thing is to know what you want to get out of this interview, but it's also important to see the longer arc of the relationship and what could be possible over time. Sometimes, yes, you're just dealing with a reporter you're never going to see again. But often, especially for startups, you're working with reporters who cover startups, and they are probably reporters whose beat intersects with what you do. So if you're a robotics company, they're probably on the robotics beat or something like that, the hardware beat, and enterprise technology, security, so on. So for them, an interview with you is also a way to make a connection, get another source in their book, and build a relationship that could pay off for them over time. Because relationships are a kind of currency for reporters, just as they are for PR people. The story that a reporter writes about you is probably more valuable to you than it is to them. But they're putting time into you. And I have definitely seen cases where reporters sort of identify what they think are up and comers with the idea that when you are approaching some kind of big, like an M&A or an IPO, that they'll be in pole position to get that story, right? So the relationship is potentially valuable to them. It's clearly valuable to you in the meantime, because, if you hit it off with a reporter, they'll be more likely to pick up your news in the future if you can convince them that your company is worth paying attention to and that you can deliver in an interview what they need, that it's time well spent for them whenever they're interacting with you. Not only are they more likely to pick up your news when you have news, but they're more likely to come to you when they need comment on a story that's someone in your industry. So the relationship building is absolutely, it's maybe not the absolute first thing you're concerned about, but it's closely behind. It runs a very close second.
And that's almost one for the PR team to sort of track as well, right? Okay, as you get bigger, this reporter has been following us for some time. Now we have this juicy exclusive. Who gets it? How do we pass these out? You don't want to snub someone at that final stage. Or, for this sort of almost unwritten rule, if you are a spokesperson, okay, I have a really good relationship with this reporter and I want to give this story to them, let's definitely feed that in because you've been speaking to them.
Yeah, in the best case, it's you have this problem that's a good problem to have where you have so many strong relationships with reporters that you have to worry about disappointing someone by giving your news to someone else. That's a classic sort of PR challenge to something that your PR team is thinking about and will help with. The solutions to that can sometimes look like promising for those who didn't get the news this time, promising a piece of good news down the road, or splitting up the news that you have into exclusive opportunities, like you get the visit to the factory, you get the interview with the partner, that kind of thing. The benefits is, but again, that's all off in the future once you've built these relationships. But yeah, you're trying to put yourself in the position over the course of many interviews to have a wealth of positive relationships with reporters that are paying off in various ways.
So the other goal here, of course, is that you want to convert the interview into an actual article. Just because a reporter is talking to you doesn't mean they're necessarily going to write about you. You've got to say something interesting and you've got to convert it in a positive way.
Right. And, I see that as the outcome of the best practices we're recommending here. If you come in prepared, if you hit your key messages, you build a rapport, you'll be in the best position you can to get the outcome you want out of the interview. You know what you want, you've said what the things you need to say to get it, and you've been personable enough in the interview to make the reporter well disposed, or at least you haven't done anything to make them want to not include you in the interview. We always tell our clients that nothing inks until it inks, right? Like you don't have coverage until it inks. You never know. It's not the decision to have you in the article or not is not always entirely up to the reporter. These days, it's mostly up to the reporter, but editors have their say. They may cut you out for whatever reason. Sometimes changes are made to a story that are beyond the reporter's control. And sometimes a reporter with all the best will in the world comes in thinking their story is going to look a certain way. And then they realize once they've done all their reporting, their research, their interviews, that the story doesn't look quite what they thought it would. So they take it in a direction that doesn't include you. Usually I find reporters are, apologetic and hope you'll understand. And you need to, because that's just the nature of the game. It's, ultimately, when you are presenting yourself as a spokesperson, you are providing a service to the reporter. It's important not to sort of expect that it's a quid pro quo. And we'll talk about this more, I think, when we get to how to follow up on an interview. But overall, the conversion ought to take care of itself if you're doing the right things in the interview. And again, I want to stress this is also a responsibility of your PR team, right? So let's just think typically when your typical spokesperson is not a press secretary, in the startup world, they're not doing this all the time. They're running a business. They're making products. They're in product review meetings and they're talking to the CFO and they're talking to investors and they have a million other things on their mind. I'm really sympathetic to a spokesperson who gets a request to speak to the media and says, gosh, happy to do it if it's helpful, but I'm not really going to have a lot of time to dedicate to this. And I'm not quite sure why we're doing this. That's why it's so important for the PR team who has been in touch with the reporter, been thinking about these issues, to be able to brief the executive on those questions so that they have clarity coming in what they're trying to do. Now, look, some spokespeople are more enthusiastic about this whole exercise than others. Some love talking to the press. Some loathe talking to the press. Generally, they understand that as a senior executive at an up-and-coming company, it's part of the job. But they ought to expect their PR managers, their PR team, to give them the material they need to do well in the interview. And at minimum, that means understanding why I'm here and what I need to say.
Let's talk about what a reporter wants from a spokesperson. What are they looking for?
Right. Well, the number one thing is material that they can and use in their story, whatever that is. Accuracy and clarity are
Mm.
probably right at the top. The reporter is going to assume that whatever you tell them is true. It's usable in a story, it's quotable.
Hmm.
The classic PR advice to spokespeople is don't say anything you wouldn't want to see in print. Never assume that what you say is off the record. Don't even play around with off the record. If you have the kind of relationship with a reporter where you can just say this is off the record and you can trust them, you're probably going to know it because they'll have told you, or you've been doing this for 10 years or something, or you'll have reached a certain prominence in the industry that reporters are sort of indicating to you that that is okay. But in general, for 95% or more of the people we work with, off the record just shouldn't even be something they think about. When you speak, you want to be clear, you want to be concise, you want to be accurate. And because that is difficult, especially for a spokesperson who's spokespersoning part-time. They might not have every fact at their fingertips. It's important to understand that's okay. In fact, it is a sign, I think, of maturity in a spokesperson and sort of skill in a spokesperson when they realize that I don't know the exact percentage, or I don't know if that customer is publicly referenceable, right? So I'm not going to even bring it up. I'll say, I think I have a customer in mind who might be great for you to follow up with. I'm not quite sure where we are in publicizing our
Hmm.
relationship with them. Let me talk to the PR team and they'll get back to you and let you know. Reporter is usually fine with that. What is a problem is when you say something that is out of bounds, and then usually there will be a PR staffer on the call, either from the agency you're working with or from your in-house team. They will usually notice if you've said something that you want to dial back, and they can then sort of work to do that after the call. But sometimes you might make a comment that it goes beyond the bounds of the existing messaging, and no one on you're the only person who is in a position to know if it's true, and then it turns out not to be true, and you only find out when the story publishes and the CFO calls the CEO and says, like, wait, how did that number is wrong? How did that get out there? And the CEO says, oh, geez, I must have said the wrong number. And then they call the PR team and they say, can you get the reporter to change the story? Not ideal if you're trying to establish yourself as a trusted, reliable source, right? So this is where accuracy, if you're trying to be accurate and clear in the moment, it's also important to know when you're shading into areas where you're not quite 100% sure, and then just defer whatever you're about to say to the follow-up phase. That's all fine. Secondarily, and this goes to the point about building the relationship building that we talked about earlier, increasingly, I think it's always been true, but even more so these days, that reporters want to feel they're getting something authentic out of you. It's not just accuracy and clarity, but they want to feel like they're having a real conversation and they're not just getting the output of an LLM trained on your key messaging. There is an art, and the truth is you get better at it the more you do. There is an art to being able to deliver your key messages in a way that feels natural and authentic. And there's some people are just naturally better at it than others. I always see spokespeople improve with practice, but authenticity is desirable. You might even ask, why am I on the phone with a reporter in the first place? They could just ask these questions and get email answers. Some reporters, given their workflow, especially if they don't report full time, if they're analysts or they have a blog or something, they might actually prefer email interviews because they don't have time to get on the phone and process a transcript and do all the work that comes with setting up a phone interview. But the other side of that is that a lot of reporters, especially the more experienced ones, prefer live conversations because they feel they get more authentic quotes. They're not going to get the canned quote that the PR agency prepared in consultation with the product manager. And the other thing, and I encountered this when I was reporting, I cringe when I think about how I took a quote from a company I was reporting on and I just trusted that it was an original quote. And it turned out they'd used the exact same quote somewhere else. And it was embarrassing for me. And that you don't want a reporter to come away from their interaction with you feeling exposed and embarrassed like they got suckered. Because that's how I felt.
They just so this company gave you the quote, a canned quote, and the same quote to somebody else. And so it's in two different articles. And
Right. I mean, it's one thing if the quote is in a press release and the reporter, has a reasonable expectation that other people might use it. And then they can say that such and such company said in a statement, quote, right? But if they're representing it like a quote that was given to them directly by the spokesperson, and this person supposedly gave the exact same quote word for word to someone else, it just looks like in the worst case, it looks like you or the other reporter plagiarized.
It's poor form.
Right. So the point for some reporters is not only do you get more natural sounding quotes, you're more likely to get an original quote.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's important to understand where the reporter is coming from, because you as a spokesperson, like, they may know what their story is going to be. I'm looking for an example of a company that sort of fits into this trend. It could be you. I pretty much know what I want you to say. I want you to say you've seen this trend and this is the outcome from it. So I need you to say that. And so you're that example. And, for a lot of startups getting out into the business press, that's going to be one of the things. You are an example of a trend. Hey, we're a company that's returning to the office, or whatever it might be, right? That's doing that's combining, it's having the CRO position, or whatever the trend is. I just need you in this position. Anyone else can be in there too. So, talk to me, about that. So if your spokesperson comes in and just starts, explaining all about the company and not having read the messaging, guess what? I just move on. I'll just get somebody else to say this, right?
That's right. And I will say that most interviews I've sat in on my career, reporting as a profession tends to attract curious people. So it's rare that you don't get a chance to say what you do and what makes you different. It's really just a question of balance. And I think reporters even quickly come to understand that this is the price of admission. Even if they're not interested in that at all, they'll give you a chance to say it because they just know that you're going to have to.
Yeah.
You're going to feel the need to. So let's get it out of the way at the beginning, at minimum, and then get to the bit that is most relevant to the story. But that said, in order to include you in the story, they do need to have some understanding of who you are, what you do, the size of your business. And they are, as I said earlier, they do tend to actually take an interest in the world, and you're part of the world and they're interested in you. You just need, and this is part of the prep, to understand how interested a reporter probably is in you and as a company, and not press it beyond where it's going to be useful to go. I have definitely seen spokespeople drag out the description of their business and get down into levels of detail the reporter's interested in. And you can almost sense, this was before video was common, you could somehow just detect the reporter silently turning off.
Can't hear them typing anymore.
Yeah, it's something like, it could be that. But the next time they ask a question, they're just not into it anymore.
You don't want to be that. So let's talk a little bit about prepping for the interview and then how to handle the interview. We just talked a bit about the PR team's going to give you a briefing sheet. It might be called different things, but like a briefing sheet about how we set up this interview, what we want to say, a bit of the background about the journalist, some of the questions that we think are probably going to come up, some of the articles that they have written before, so you can kind of get a sense for that, maybe a couple of quotes and some data so that you've got it all, plus all the logistics and, like, where is this meeting? So that's an important, there's quite a lot of work to prep that up nicely for a big interview.
Right. So there are as many approaches to the briefing sheet as there are PR professionals and spokespeople. You can see that over time, for instance, I've noticed that PR pros at VC firms tend to produce really, really short briefing notes for their spokespeople, the VCs they work with, partly because they understand that their spokesperson is only going to devote a small amount of time to processing the information. So it has to be the absolute bare bones of what's happening in the interview. Also, probably because they've worked together enough before that they have a sense for what is needed. When you're working like hand in glove day to day, you're doing a lot of media ops, you can compress that prep more. But typically, for a spokesperson who is doing interviews once a month or maybe once every couple of months, like a CEO who might not be having a lot of touches with the media, I do think that it's important for the PR to provide some of those elements that I discussed earlier. You need to be really clear about the purpose of the interview. And it's often surprising how top executives will say, "Why am I doing this?" And you're just thinking, as a PR person, your whole job is to make it happen. And you're thinking, because it's my job to make it happen. You sort of exist in my mind as the person who, as like, when I succeed in my job, I get you on the phone. We're doing this because I succeeded in my job. I think it's easy for a junior PR person to think, but it's natural and even healthy, I think, for a spokesperson to ask, what am I trying to accomplish here? And it's not even necessarily evident to me that I'm the best person. So why am I here myself and what are we trying to do? You need to be clear about that so that the executive is comfortable being on the call. I like to lay out key messages. Sometimes some people separate key messages and sound bites. I think that can get a little clunky. I try to condense those into one section. I also like to lay out a game plan for the interview so that the spokesperson can sort of play it out in their mind, assuming we're not having a prep call, which I'll get to in a moment. Something I've increasingly done over the course of my career is to tell executives what we've already told the reporter, so that they don't need to recapitulate in great detail material that the reporter already has. It also can help identify any misgivings that the company might have about, like, we might have gotten a number from someone over in the company and the CEO says, well, no, we have an updated number on that. We should make sure that they have the new number. So getting some clarity on what's already been said can help identify not only areas you don't need to go into as much, but maybe areas that are still missing, areas to be filled in the conversation. And then, as you said, yes, you'll provide background on the reporter, what they've previously covered. You want to give some examples of stories they've written before. I think, again, different executives have different levels of tolerance for doing that kind of research, like reading up on the reporter they're talking to. I find most do. And just to get a feel for the kind of coverage they might be getting themselves, I think it's important. It helps orient you as to the kinds of questions you're likely to be asked. It also helps narrow your focus, because when you step in to an opportunity as a spokesperson and you've never heard of the reporter, you've never worked with the publication, it feels like it could be anything from national news to a trade newsletter read by 1,000 potential buyers. And you just have no idea. Getting a sense of how they cover the news is a really good way to get your mind in the right place for the interview. But most of all, I really feel like a prep call, even if it's just 15 minutes, is really, really helpful. So I will typically do not just run the executive through key messages, but also do a bit of mock interviewing, because I know from my own experience presenting that even material well, when you're saying it for the first time, you can trip all over it. But just even the experience of tripping all over it in prep somehow magically transforms most of the time to clean execution on the call.
Yeah.
So you would think the CEO bungled every one of these questions. That means it's going to be a disaster. Not true, in my experience. Somehow bungling it first can improve the final outcome. So it's not always possible. Sometimes you get an interview request with a 2-hour deadline and you can't do the full briefing sheet. You can't do the full prep call. Part of the job of the PR rep is to figure out the best version of this process for the time you have available and the work habits of the spokesperson that's going to be on the call.
Right. So there's quite a lot of the success of this is in the prep. So that's why we're sort of dwelling on that. In the interview, like, we don't want to be doing media. This isn't a media training thing. So like,
No.
media training is important, but obviously you've got to get across your messages in a concise way and sort of answer the questions. Sometimes you're going to get tricky questions. All the standard advice applies there about sort of bridging to another topic, etc. So, I feel like, as you had said, if you don't know the answer, you can always circle back on that rather than sort of make the statement and then it's out there, because it's very difficult to retract. I mean, look, a lot of reporters will, but they don't have to. And you're sort of burning credits on that a little bit. And, you want the reporter not to have that. Well, I interviewed them and then I had to keep changing the customers that they mentioned because actually we spent 10 minutes talking about this one customer who's not even referenceable and now they want to cut that. So you don't want any of that stuff. I don't want to dive deep into the actual media training part of this. Suffice to say, media training is a thing, and it's important that your spokespeople sort of go through it and go through it regularly because, like you said, Chris, the reps are important. And if it's on broadcast, then you've got the whole video aspect of it and getting comfortable with that, how to present. This is an art form, and so you do need to go through that, even if it's just the prep call, right? Just get a little bit of warm up. How long are these interviews going to be, though? Like, I think for a lot of spokespeople, you feel like you're going to, hey, I'm warming up for an hour of discussion here where we're really going to deeply dive into this topic. But that's just never the case.
I would say that the number has waxed and waned over the course of my career. And it will also depend on the kind of company you're at and the kind of story it is. Occasionally, if you're doing a big feature, like an exclusive story, the reporter might want an hour. That's, I find, pretty rare these days. I'd say the standard interview is 30 minutes now. I have seen, back in the days when there were more publications than they are now, and minor announcements got more coverage than they do now, 15 minutes wasn't unusual because all you were doing was you were basically giving a quote and validating some facts, and you're on to your next 6 interviews. But nowadays, I would say that if a reporter's interacting with you, it's probably a half an hour with about 10 minutes dedicated to who you are, what you do, or if they've already talked to you, what's new. And then 20 minutes getting into the substance of the interview for the story. Sometimes 20 minutes is all they need. So expect 20 to 30 minutes in most cases.
And that's going to go by really quickly. So when we talk about, hey, you got to get across these 3 messages, you got to get into them and hit them pretty quickly because, the interviews are fast in my experience. When you're being interviewed, you're like, okay, and you're trying to think of sound bites, and you're trying to say something original, and you're trying to sort of avoid tricky topics and trying to get across your key messages. That's going to go real fast. So expect that. I think that's great.
Yeah. I mean, the one bit of media training that, might be worth touching on in this connection is that usually in an interview, a reporter will say, is there anything I've missed? And that is the opportunity for you to deliver any key messages that you haven't mentioned, or to circle back and reinforce what you consider the most important message of the interview. Of all the key messages, there might be just one that you really want to get across. And it's standard practice for the reporter to give you that space, and it's useful for them just because, in journalism training, in journalism school, you're often taught that sometimes the most important and best quote you get is the sort of offhand quote that you get at the end of the interview. Now, if you're following these directions, that's not what they're going to get. They're not going to get the offhand quote. They're going to get what you prepared. You are likely to have an opportunity at the end, and you probably don't need to jam messages in unnaturally if it doesn't come up.
Yeah. So if you skipped over a point, you can say, hey, we touched on this, but I did want to just raise that actually related to that. And then you can go into that point if it wasn't made. So you can sort of tick all 3 off or check all 3 off.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just say, no, there's nothing. I think we covered it, because you're just missing the chance. You could, even if you've covered all 3, you can just go, okay, the key points here were, X, Y, and Z. How should the spokesperson follow up?
That is a deceptively simple question. I think the short version of it is that a thanks for your time is looking forward to the story is never amiss. The nuance is that most reporters don't want their coverage to be seen as a gift to you. So it's important in the follow-up not to sort of thank them for helping you out with a great story. An independent journalist is covering you because you are objectively interesting to their readership. The implication that they're doing you a favor is sort of like saying they have signed on to your marketing program. Some reporters take that more, bridle at that more than others. But in general, it's safer to thank the reporter for their time, for their in-depth treatment of the subject, for their grasp of the material, and just express how you'd very much like to keep them abreast of your future news. And please be in touch. If I can help with anything you're working on, my door is always open. That is a pretty much no fail kind of message. The other thing, especially in these times of difficulty for the media industry, it's never amiss to just go out and promote it, to amplify the story that was written, to get more clicks, get more eyeballs on the story. Again, it's important not to present in your social media promotion this story as a sort of a messaging win for you. But there's no harm in saying, great to see such and such, great to see such and such executive in today's Wall Street Journal, such an important point he made, include a quote from the interview. I will say consult your PR rep. I am increasingly seeing executives thank reporters for the interview when they promote the coverage on LinkedIn. I think it's becoming increasingly accepted, but I really would recommend getting your PR team's input, because reporters they're individuals and they have radically different views on how they'll take that kind of message.
Yeah, it's hotly debated because people have different opinions about it. And of course, in the follow-up, just to be clear, if you promise something in the interview, you've got to follow up really quickly with those extra materials or clarify. Your PR team will help you with this, but like, hey, I promised to come back to you with this data point or whatever. If you've got actions, you got to get that stuff back to them quickly so that they can write their article. But I think your point about thanking the reporter for their time, amplification of the article, some report, that the clicks and the impressions are often the currency, and some reporters are almost measured by that. And, everyone wants their stuff to be read. So anything you can do to do that, I think, shows gratitude. And in fact, some may feel that if you don't do that, you are unhappy with the work, or maybe, hey, they'll just choose the next person, because you didn't amplify my article. So, absolutely make sure that you personally and your company, if you can, are sharing the article so that we're getting more eyeballs on it. And, and you should. Yeah, that's the game. So I think that's key. All right. Chris, thanks for this. Really enjoyed sort of diving into what makes a great spokesperson. Obviously, the whole sort of interview media training topic is going to be another episode. But I think this is a vitally important part of senior execs' roles, and you will get better with practice, but hopefully this helps set you up for success. And thank you all for listening to this, and please drop us a comment or follow us in all the usual places, and we look forward to talking to you all again next week.